So who was to blame in the Cold War? Was it the USSR? Was it Stalin? Was it the United States, or Truman, or Roosevelt? Was it mutual misunderstandings or incompatible ideologies of capitalism and communism? Was it great power rivalry? Well, we'll look at a number of different interpretations of blame in the Cold War. Well, the traditional view taken by Western historians in the 1950s was that it was the Soviet Union's actions and Stalin's actions that were more to blame in starting the Cold War. Their interpretation is that Stalin was driven by his ideology into expanding Soviet influence, exporting communism into Eastern Europe in an aggressive expansionism seeking to promote his ideology. This can be seen as agreements at Yalta that post-war governments in Eastern Europe would be coalitions and then there would be democratic elections. Well, the Yalta agreements were broken in Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe by the use of salami tactics, rigged elections, murder, and so on. Furthermore, Stalin set up some organizations which seemed like a direct challenge and increased tension. Comecon, for example, was set up in response to Marshall aid offered to Western Europe by the USA, Comecon being an economic cooperation organization. And more worryingly, perhaps, for the West, Cominform was an organization set up to make sure that Eastern European governments basically followed the Soviet line. It could be interpreted as being the offspring of Comintern, an organization seeking to promote worldwide revolution. In that sense, it seemed the Soviet Union was perhaps being aggressive, and these organizations were cause for concern, Comecon and Cominform. A lot of the actions taken by the Soviet Union can also be drawn towards Stalin. And Stalin was certainly motivated by an overwhelming desire to achieve security for the Soviet Union. Now, in this way, I guess you could blame the Soviet Union, but you could also give it as a reason to explain the actions of Stalin and the USSR, and perhaps also to defend those actions. Well, certainly Stalin was a very paranoid character, and in terms of wanting security, though, he did have certain concerns with historical reasons behind them. For example, back in the Civil War, after the October Revolution, the Western governments, Britain and the United States, had actually supported the whites against the communists. Churchill himself had been in charge of dispatching aid to the whites, and so right from the birth of the Soviet Union, the Western powers had been sending military forces to oppose it. So in that sense, suspicion and distrust on the part of Stalin. Furthermore, throughout the 1930s, Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policy seemed to Stalin to be pushing the Nazis into a conflict with the Soviet Union. By allowing them the Sudetenland and the invasion of Czechoslovakia, he felt that they were encouraging eastward expansion of the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, towards the Soviet Union. So again, increasing the mistrust there. Furthermore, during the war itself, obviously the bulk of the losses in Europe, this is not to diminish the losses suffered by the forces of Britain, the United States and others, but the largest percentage of blood and treasure was being spent by the Soviets on the Eastern Front, pushing towards Germany. And it was Stalin's view that the Allies unnecessarily delayed D-Day in the West, hoping perhaps that Germany and the Soviet Union would cancel each other out, would exhaust each other in a titanic battle. He felt that D-Day was unnecessarily late. It does seem that that was not true. From research into documents at the time, it seems that basically the Allies did mount it at the time they felt was best, but certainly Stalin felt that they had unnecessarily delayed it to cause maximum damage to the Soviet Union against Germany. Furthermore, again, during the war, the German Enigma code was beaten by code breakers at Bletchley Park. Alan Turing was a very famous father of computer science who actually helped develop the first computer in order to break the German code. But the British Secret Service did not share the methods, the cryptography of how they had broken the Enigma code with Stalin. So again, he felt suspicion there. Sorry, that's a picture of the German Enigma machine. Germany was a huge concern to Stalin. Russia had actually been invaded in the 17th century, in the 19th century by Napoleon, and twice in the 20th century by Germany, as well as also by Poland. So he had real security fears about Germany. This made him act, again, perhaps in a more aggressive and paranoid fashion. For example, he took the opportunity with the Berlin blockade to try and remove Western presence from East Germany. Hence, the Berlin blockade, Stalin's fears about Germany enhancing Cold War tensions. Well, certainly we can't only lay blame at the door of the Soviet Union and Stalin, so let's look at some actions and interpretations which might blame the USA. And indeed, some Western historians, the so-called revisionists, blamed the USA, and these were coming out with works in the 1960s, 1970s, and even up to today. So how can we blame actions of the West? Well, Marshall aid, in one sense, could be viewed as altruistic, as selfless, as simply seeking to help the peoples of war-torn Europe to recover from the war. But certainly one of the motivations of it was also fear that poverty was a breeding ground for communism. And also the aid, the very large amount of aid, was tied in with certain conditions. Countries had to open up their economies to the United States, and that could be viewed as a form of dollar imperialism. In fact, that's what Molotov, the Russian foreign minister, the Soviet foreign minister rather, called it. He called it dollar imperialism. So Marshall aid could be viewed as an attempt to increase Western influence, specifically the United States, by tying in European economies to the American capitalist system. And so in that way, Marshall aid itself could be viewed as an aggressive move. Furthermore, if we look at Germany, remember that Germany was a particular concern, a particular fear of Stalin. A resurgent Germany could prove a threat to the Soviet Union. Well, a number of actions taken by the Western powers, again, troubled Stalin and led him into responses and actions. So the British sector and the American sector, they first incorporated, they combined into Bizonia, and later all three Western sectors became Trizonia. Well, Stalin felt, with some justification, that went against the spirit of the Potsdam Agreement, where any major changes about the future of Germany should be agreed by all four powers. And this, together with the introduction of a new currency, the Deutschmark, in the Western zones, Stalin felt that both of these things went against the Potsdam Agreement and seemed to be an attempt to create a new, powerful West German state which could be a threat to the Soviet Union. And indeed, it's the latter introduction of the currency which seems to have prompted the Berlin blockade. So you can see actions and counteractions on both sides here. Let's move on then. So look at, let's consider, there's a Harry Truman there. Certainly Mr. Truman himself had that's the wrong word, had been appointed president of the United States after the death of Roosevelt, but he did lack international experience. So on the one hand, we can blame perhaps Stalin for his paranoia. We can also blame Truman for perhaps being very blunt and lacking diplomacy. Furthermore, the development of the atomic bomb and its use on Japan without telling the Soviet Union first, this appeared to have made Truman more confident, more belligerent, more aggressive, more bossy at the Potsdam Conference, and also it sparked a reaction in the Soviet Union of them developing their own atomic weapons. So the development of atomic weapons by the United States can be seen to accelerate increased tensions in the Cold War. Let's move on and look at the actions of Winston Churchill. So I guess he's obviously within the orbit of the West. He's an ally of the United States. And certainly Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, essentially comparing the danger of the Soviet Union to the danger of Nazi Germany and warning not to appease the Soviet Union. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech certainly increased Cold War tensions. Let's have a look at some more modern interpretations of blame, where it's a number of other factors, as well as one-sided blame of one side or the other, can be considered. Certainly, it's an ideological struggle. Either the capitalist system will prevail or the communist system. Both sides believe that their system is correct. In terms of the ideological struggle, there's some evidence for this. Certainly, if we look at the Russian Revolution, Western countries did send military forces against the Russians back in 1918, 1919. But what might undermine that argument is the fact that the countries were allies in the Second World War, and throughout the 1930s there was no particular conflict. What does, obviously, conditions that set up the Cold War conflict are the defeat of Nazi Germany, which leaves a power vacuum which has been filled by the Red Army in the East and advancing Allied forces in the West. So essentially, military forces controlled by the Soviet Union and by the Allied powers are now occupying Europe. So the circumstances of the Second World War have brought the two forces into a possible confrontation. Obviously, in the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, things seem to be going well. But then you have this bipolar world with, on the one hand, the superpower, a massive superpower, the United States, and the Soviet Union also clearly in a better position in some ways. It's suffered a huge amount of death and destruction, but it controls a large amount of territory. And so then the actions of the United States and the Soviet Union are interpreted perhaps through ideological spectacles. So Stalin's motivation for helping to establish Soviet-dominated regimes in Eastern Europe may have been motivated largely by security concerns. He wants a buffer zone to protect Russia, but this is viewed by the West as aggressive Soviet expansion, as they view his actions through an ideological lens. The United States' response to that, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, again seems very aggressive to the Soviet Union. They see that as American imperialism. So in that sense, it can be viewed as misunderstandings of the actions of both parties through the spectacle of ideology. So I hope you've made notes on both sides, and good luck with the exam and the quiz.